It's funny how one moment can change your entire life, like an earthquake that shatters the ground you thought was stable. That's exactly how it felt when I first laid eyes on Ginger. But before I dive into that, I need to tell you one thing: I wasn't looking for love. I wasn't looking for anything, really. Love and I had an agreement, a cold, silent truce. After what happened with Lena, I thought I'd never let anyone get close again. Yet, here I am, telling you about how that plan went to hell the second Ginger smiled at me. It was late afternoon, the kind where the sky's a fading watercolor, half blue, half pink, and I was walking down 9th Avenue, just trying to clear my head. My buddy Jack had been chewing my ear off about some business idea that involved alpacas, and I needed fresh air to remember why I kept him around. Then, out of nowhere, she appeared. Ginger. A burst of color in a world that had gone a little too gray for my taste. She was sitting at an outdoor café, reading a book, her red curls bouncing as she absent-mindedly nodded to the rhythm of some jazz pouring out from the speakers overhead. I stopped mid-step like I'd just forgotten how to walk. That's when she looked up, caught me staring, and did this little half-smile that melted something inside me I didn't know was still frozen. In that split second, I knew two things: one, I was screwed, and two, I didn't care. I wish I could tell you I walked right up to her and said something smooth, like in the movies, but no. I froze. My brain went offline, and I just stood there, probably looking like a guy who'd been hit by a truck. To my surprise, she gave a tiny wave, and I forced my legs to move, like a rusty old machine suddenly coming back to life. Nice evening, I managed, which in retrospect was the most basic thing I could have said. She looked at me, eyes the color of the sea after a storm, and said, "Depends. Are you planning to sit down or keep blocking the view?" I laughed, a sound that felt weird in my own ears, and pulled out the chair opposite her. I was half expecting her to tell me to move along, but she didn't. Instead, she marked her place in her book and gave me that look again, the one that made me forget how to breathe. "I'm Paul," I said, offering my hand. "Ginger," she replied, shaking it like we were signing a deal. I wanted to ask a million questions, but I couldn't stop staring at her smile. "You're not from around here," she guessed, tilting her head slightly. "Is it that obvious?" "Yeah. You've got that look like you're trying to figure out if the city's going to eat you alive or just nibble at your soul." I couldn't help but grin. "You could say that. I'm just passing through, trying to catch my breath." "From what?" I hesitated. "How do you tell a stranger you're running from a heartbreak without sounding pathetic?" "Life. Sometimes it gets too loud." She nodded, like she knew exactly what I meant. We fell into this easy rhythm, talking about nothing and everything, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to pretend to be fine. When I finally looked at my watch, 2 hours had slipped by without me noticing. Ginger glanced at her phone and sighed. "I should go. My roommate's probably wondering if I got kidnapped." "Yeah, can't have that," I joked, but my chest tightened at the thought of her leaving. She stood up, and I followed suit. As she gathered her things, she looked at me, her eyes a mix of mischief and something else. "Same time tomorrow?" I didn't even pretend to hesitate. "Absolutely." As she walked away, I felt something unfamiliar, a flutter of hope, like maybe the world wasn't as dark as I'd convinced myself it was. I watched her until she disappeared around a corner, already counting the hours until I could see her again. But here's the thing, sometimes, life throws you a curveball right when you think you've found your balance. And looking back, I should have known that meeting Ginger was the start of something bigger than just a chance encounter. I just didn't know if it would end in bliss or heartbreak. Or maybe both. The days with Ginger slipped by like golden sand through my fingers, a blur of laughter, conversations that ran too deep for two people who had only just met, and the kind of comfortable silence you only find with someone who feels like home. It wasn't like anything I had experienced before. It was sudden and reckless and filled with a brightness I hadn't realized I was starving for. I saw her almost every day. We'd meet at the same café where we first spoke, then wander the city like two kids let loose on a playground too big to conquer. She had this way of making even the most mundane things feel electric. Watching a street performer, trying out ridiculous hats at a thrift store, debating over which ice cream flavor was superior. It all felt like pieces of a life I didn't know I'd been missing. I found myself telling her things I hadn't shared with anyone. About my family, the rift between me and my brother, the ways I had failed and the ways I had been hurt. She listened without judgment, her gaze steady and kind, like she was collecting the broken parts of me and holding them close without flinching. In return, she offered her own stories, her own wounds, and dreams and fears. It was like we were two pieces from different puzzles that somehow fit together. Days turned into weeks, and the thought of her became something constant, a hum beneath everything else. I was reckless with it, letting myself believe that the universe had finally handed me something good, something pure and real. The night I decided to propose, the air was crisp and cool, the city glowing softly under the streetlights. We were sitting on a bench by the river, the water rippling with reflections of light. Ginger had her head resting on my shoulder, her fingers laced through mine. She was talking about something, but I could barely focus on her words because the thought that had been building inside me for days had finally solidified into certainty. I loved her. It was simple and complicated all at once. I loved her for her kindness, her laughter, the way she could make me feel seen and understood even when I was stumbling over my own words. I loved her for the fire in her eyes when she talked about the things she cared about and the gentleness she showed to people who didn't deserve it. The words slipped out before I had time to second-guess myself. Marry me. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even phrased like a question. It was a statement, a plea, a promise all rolled into one. Ginger lifted her head and stared at me, her eyes wide with surprise and something else, something that made my chest tighten. I'm serious, I said, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I know it's sudden, I know it's crazy, but I've never been more sure of anything. She laughed, this startled, breathless sound that made me feel like I had just given her the best gift in the world. Then she threw her arms around me and said yes. Just like that, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it was. Maybe when something feels that right, you don't question it, you just dive in head first and hope the landing is soft. We spent the rest of the night planning everything and nothing, caught up in the glow of our own happiness. I hadn't even thought about a ring, but Ginger didn't seem to care. She was just as caught up in the whirlwind as I was, her eyes bright with that same wild certainty. By the time the city started to wake, we were still sitting there on that bench, our fingers intertwined, talking about the future like it was something we could bend to our will. Looking back, it's easy to say we were reckless, that we were caught up in the thrill of something new and perfect. But in that moment, it felt like the only thing that made sense. We were caught up in our own world, spinning plans for the future like it was something we could build from pure joy alone. It was Ginger who suggested we take a trip out of the city, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she mentioned her grandmother's house. I had heard her speak about her grandmother before, always with a fondness that softened her voice. She's the only family I have left, she said, but I could hear something unspoken beneath her words, a hesitation she tried to hide behind a smile. I agreed without hesitation, eager to meet the woman who had shaped so much of the person I loved. The drive was longer than I expected, the city melting away into sprawling fields and dense, shadowed woods that stretched for miles. Ginger guided me through winding backroads until we reached a sprawling estate that looked like it had been pulled from another century. The house was enormous, its stone walls covered in ivy, the kind of place you'd expect to see in some faded black and white photograph. Ginger laughed at my wide-eyed expression, squeezing my hand as if to say it's just a house, but I could tell it was more than that. As we walked up the steps, my nerves twisted into knots. It felt like we were crossing some invisible threshold, stepping into a world I didn't quite understand. Ginger's grandmother, Eleanor, greeted us at the door with a warmth that caught me off guard. She was elegant and sharp-eyed, her hair silver but her posture still upright and commanding. She hugged Ginger tightly, her eyes crinkling with genuine affection before turning to me with an appraising gaze that made me feel like she could see straight through me. "So, you're the one who stole my granddaughter's heart," she said, her voice rich and steady. I laughed, trying to shake off the sudden weight of her scrutiny. We settled into the sitting room, a place filled with antique furniture and portraits that stared down with the kind of solemnity reserved for history books. It was clear this wasn't just a house. It was a legacy. As the evening went on, I found myself drawn to Eleanor's stories, tales of her youth, of the family that had once filled these halls with noise and life. Ginger listened with a reverence I hadn't seen before, her fingers tracing patterns on the arm of her chair as if she were trying to memorize every word. At some point, Eleanor left us to explore the house, encouraging Ginger to show me the garden she had loved as a child. We wandered through the manicured hedges and rosebushes, Ginger's laughter echoing softly in the cool evening air. It was beautiful, serene, a place untouched by the chaos of the world outside. But something nagged at me, a feeling I couldn't quite name. Later that night, as we sat on the back porch watching the stars blink into existence, I finally voiced the question that had been circling my mind. "Your grandmother mentioned your family had a long history here. What kind of history?" Ginger hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "It's complicated," she said softly. "My family, it's not like most families. We come from a line of people who were influential. Wealthy, sure, but more than that." She struggled to find the right words, her brow creasing with frustration. "There's a lot of expectation that comes with the name, traditions and responsibilities I never really cared for. That's why I left. I didn't want to be tied down by all of it." I listened, trying to piece together what she was telling me. "So, you ran away from all this?" She nodded, her eyes distant. "It felt like a cage. Everyone expecting me to be someone I'm not. Eleanor is the only one who understood. She let me go because she believed I'd come back when I was ready." "And are you?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Ginger met my gaze, her expression troubled. "I don't know. Coming back here, it's like walking into the past. It's beautiful, but it's not me." I wanted to tell her that she didn't have to choose between her past and her future, that she could build something new out of both. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached for her hand and held it tight, hoping it was enough. That night, I lay awake in one of the guest rooms, the stillness of the house pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I was missing, some secret hidden beneath the polished surface of everything Ginger had shown me. The next morning, as Eleanor and Ginger were preparing breakfast, I found myself wandering the halls, drawn to the portraits that lined the walls. They were all of people who bore some resemblance to Ginger, their features refined and their expressions proud. It hit me then that Ginger wasn't just from an influential family. She was part of something far older, something that carried weight and expectation like a crown. And she had chosen to walk away from it. It was a Tuesday afternoon, one of those rare days when I worked from home, the rain tapping softly against the windows like a lullaby. Ginger had left early for a conference, her excitement pouring through the quick goodbye kiss she gave me before rushing out the door. I spent the morning buried in spreadsheets and emails, my focus fractured but steady enough to keep me from missing her too much. When the doorbell rang, it jolted me from the haze of work. I wasn't expecting anyone, and Ginger hadn't mentioned visitors. I opened the door to find Eleanor standing there, her silver hair pinned elegantly as always, her posture impeccable despite the damp chill in the air. I invited her in, surprised but not unwelcome. We had parted on good terms the last time we visited her estate, her blessing seeming genuine enough when Ginger and I left that morning with promises to visit again soon. Eleanor stepped into the foyer with the kind of grace that made the room feel smaller, her eyes sharp and assessing as she glanced around like she was taking inventory of our modest home. She declined my offer of coffee or tea, instead folding her hands neatly in front of her as if she had rehearsed whatever she had come to say. I wasn't prepared for the words that came out of her mouth. She told me she had come alone because Ginger was too blinded by her own foolishness to see reason. She said it with such calm detachment that for a moment I couldn't process what she meant. Then she went on, her tone cool and cutting, telling me that I had no right to marry her granddaughter, that I was a stain on their family's name. Her words were precise, sharpened to draw blood. She spoke of lineage and duty, of a history so old and rich that someone like me couldn't possibly understand its weight. She told me that Ginger's name carried significance, a legacy built over generations, and that her family had always planned for her to marry someone worthy of that bloodline. I felt my fists clench at my sides, the insult settling in my chest like a stone. I tried to explain that Ginger wasn't interested in all of that she had made her own choice and her choice was me. But Eleanor shook her head with a pitying smile, like she was speaking to a child who couldn't grasp the simplest of truths. She told me I was nothing more than a distraction, a phase Ginger would eventually grow tired of once she remembered where she truly belonged. And then she revealed the worst of it. She had already arranged for Ginger to meet someone else, someone who came from a family with ties just as old and influential as their own. She spoke of the man's name like it was supposed to impress me, like the mere mention of his family's wealth and connections would make me step aside. When I told her it didn't matter, that Ginger had already accepted my proposal, Eleanor's eyes narrowed, the mask of civility slipping just enough for me to glimpse the steel beneath it. She warned me that her family had resources, that if I continued to interfere, she would ensure my life became very difficult. She listed off her contacts with an ease that made my stomach twist, dropping names I had only heard in passing, people whose influence stretched far beyond anything I had ever known. She made it clear that she was willing to destroy me if that's what it took to sever my ties to Ginger. I wanted to argue, to throw her out of the house and tell her that nothing she said could change how Ginger and I felt about each other. But her confidence shook me, her certainty that Ginger's devotion was something fragile, something that could be broken under the weight of pressure and manipulation. As she continued to speak, I felt the anger rise inside me, a hot, prickling sensation that made my skin itch. But underneath the fury was fear. Not for myself, but for Ginger. I couldn't help but wonder how much of her life had been shaped by her grandmother's expectations, how many decisions had been made for her before she ever had a chance to make them herself. Eleanor seemed to sense my hesitation, her gaze sharpening as she leaned in closer, her voice lowering to a hiss. She said I would never be able to give Ginger the life she deserved, that eventually Ginger would realize it too and leave me behind. Better to end it now, she insisted, before I dragged her granddaughter down into a life of mediocrity. The words stung more than I cared to admit. She had seen through me, past the bravado and the stubbornness, to the insecurity I kept buried beneath layers of certainty. I knew I wasn't wealthy or influential. I didn't have the kind of connections Eleanor seemed to think were so vital. All I had was the way Ginger looked at me, the way she laughed when I said something ridiculous, the way her fingers curled around mine like she never wanted to let go. But Eleanor was right about one thing. I couldn't give her the world Eleanor had built for her. All I could offer was myself. When Eleanor finally left, her heels clicking against the tile with a precision that felt like a challenge, I stood there for a long time, my hands still shaking from the confrontation. I wanted to call Ginger, to tell her what had happened, but something stopped me. I didn't want to poison what we had with her grandmother's bitterness. But the doubt had already taken root, twisting its way into my thoughts like a weed. What if Eleanor was right? What if Ginger would eventually realize I wasn't enough? The thought ate at me all day, a quiet gnawing that wouldn't let me rest. By the time Ginger came home, her smile bright and her words spilling over with excitement about her conference, I had almost convinced myself not to tell her. But the fear was still there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. I kept my voice steady as we talked, tried to hide the turmoil Eleanor's visit had left behind. But I could feel something changing, a crack forming where there had once been only certainty. And I wondered if Eleanor had already won without me even realizing it. I should have seen it coming. The way Ginger's calls grew shorter, her laughter a little forced, her words less certain. She started canceling plans with me, always with some excuse that seemed too flimsy to believe but too casual to question. I told myself it was just the stress of everything, of Eleanor's disapproval, of the pressure that came from trying to bridge two worlds that were never meant to overlap. But the truth had been there all along, like a shadow I kept ignoring until it swallowed the light completely. It was Ginger who asked to meet, her voice clipped and efficient, the warmth I had grown to depend on replaced by something sharp and unfamiliar. We met at the same café where it all started, but the place felt different, colder somehow, as if the city itself had turned against me. She was already seated when I arrived, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. There was no smile, no softening at the sight of me. She got straight to the point, her words slicing through the air with the precision of a blade. She told me that her grandmother had been right all along, that she had allowed herself to be distracted by something that was never meant to be more than a fleeting amusement. She said it so casually, like she was reading from a script, her eyes fixed on me but somehow distant, like she was already looking past me to something better. I tried to argue, to remind her of the promises we had made, the future we had painted with such bright, reckless strokes. But she cut me off, her voice rising with something that sounded like contempt. She told me about Gordon, about the family connections and the wealth and the endless opportunities he could offer her. She spoke his name like it was some kind of talisman, a word that held power and meaning I could never hope to match. And then she told me the worst of it, her eyes gleaming with a cruelty I had never seen before. She said that I was nothing more than a diversion, a temporary thrill she had indulged in because it was exciting to slum it with someone so far beneath her station. She laughed when she said it, a bitter, mocking sound that twisted something deep inside me. She told me that Gordon had everything I could never give her, that he was the kind of man who understood what it meant to live a life of real consequence. And she threw Eleanor's words back at me, reminding me that I was insignificant, a nameless nobody who had wandered into her life by sheer accident. I wanted to believe it was all some cruel joke, that she was testing me, trying to push me away to protect me from whatever storm her grandmother was threatening to unleash. But there was no kindness in her gaze, no hidden tenderness beneath the fury of her words. She told me she was done pretending, that the novelty of our little romance had worn off and she was ready to move on to something real. Her words tore through me, leaving a hollow, aching void where something warm and hopeful used to be. I tried to speak, to ask her why she was doing this, but my voice came out strangled and weak. She didn't bother to hide her disdain, her smile sharp and cold as she dismissed me with a flick of her hand. She told me to go back to my simple life, to find someone more suited to my lack of ambition and pedigree. And then she stood up, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made me flinch. She walked away without looking back, her heels clicking against the tile like the ticking of a clock counting down to the moment I would wake up and realize none of it had been real. I sat there for what felt like hours, the noise of the cafe fading into a distant hum, the world around me blurring into something unrecognizable. It was as if she had stripped away everything that had made me feel alive, leaving me exposed and broken in a place that had once been filled with joy. The worst part was how easily she had discarded me, like I was nothing more than a chapter she had already finished reading. I couldn't understand how she had changed so quickly, how the person I had fallen in love with had transformed into someone so cruel and dismissive. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that maybe she hadn't changed at all. Maybe the person I loved had never really existed. Maybe I had only seen what I wanted to see, blinded by my own desperate need to believe in something good. The doubt crept in, feeding on my pain, twisting everything I thought I knew into something dark and suffocating. I replayed her words over and over, each repetition sharpening their edges until they felt like shards of glass cutting through my skin. And then came the anger, hot and wild and overpowering. Anger at Eleanor for poisoning Ginger's mind, anger at Gordon for swooping in like some predatory creature looking to claim what he believed was his by birthright, and most of all, anger at myself for believing that I could be enough for someone like Ginger. I wanted to storm after her, to confront her and demand answers, to force her to admit that everything we had meant something. But I knew it would be useless. She had made her choice, and she had made it clear that I no longer held any place in her life. The drive home was a blur of rage and despair, my thoughts spiraling into a tangle of regret and disbelief. I couldn't escape the sound of her voice, the cruelty that laced every syllable, the way she had dismissed me as if I were nothing more than a minor inconvenience she was finally free of. By the time I reached my apartment, the exhaustion had settled in, a weight pressing down on my chest so heavy I could barely breathe. I collapsed onto the couch, staring up at the ceiling as the realization of what had happened seeped into my bones. She was gone. The woman I had planned my future with, the person I had opened my heart to so completely, had walked away without hesitation or remorse. And I was left with nothing but the shattered remains of a dream that had never been real to begin with.